Okay, so hey guys, I'm just kind of here to share my experience on applying to law school in Ontario and kind of give out some tips and tricks that I wish I knew before applying because I didn't know anyone who was going to law school and I wasn't really familiar with the entire process. So these are kind of things that I wish someone would have told me when I was going into applying. So I do want to preface this that I only applied in Ontario and I don't really know about applying outside of Ontario, other schools in Canada like British Columbia. And I also don't know anything about applying to schools in the US. That wasn't even an option for me. I wanted to stay kind of close to home. So I only applied in Ontario. So with that being said, let's get into the video. I'm just going to kind of talk about different sections of your application and what you kind of need to know when you're going into applying, tips for LSAT, tips for reference letters, tips for GPA, so kind of those things that go into having a strong application when you're going to apply for law schools. So to begin, if you guys don't know, I'm sure most of you know though, if you're looking into applying to law school or you've heard about law school, every person does need to write the LSAT, which is the Law School Administration Test, and every single person who's applying has to write this test, has to get a score and has to submit that in terms of their application, and that's something that law schools do look at, and it is a big part of your application. So with that being said, let's get into kind of talking about the LSAT tips and tricks and kind of stuff that I think you should know if you're applying in Ontario. So to begin, the LSAT consists of 5 35-minute portions, and each of these portions might be a different section, they might be a repeat of the same section. But when you actually go to write the LSAT, 4 of these sections are going to be scored while 1 will be unscored. So there are myths out there about what is the scored section, what is the unscored section. In terms of the unscored section, it's really up in the air and it's not something that anyone really knows, so you should be equally prepared for all of those portions. With that being said though, there are 3 portions to the LSAT, so there's reading comprehension. So these are kind of your basic, you read a passage and you answer questions based on the passage, and then you have your logical reasoning, and then you have your analytical reasoning, and this is kind of known as logic games. So a lot of people say to focus on logical reasoning because there are 2 logical reasoning sections on each LSAT, and this will always be in your scored section, so it does take up the biggest portion of whatever you score on the LSAT. With that being said though, I do want to say that you should be focusing on areas that are your weakest. For example, let's say on your reading comprehension, you're not scoring so well, you do want to focus on sections of the LSAT that you are not the strongest in, because that's the way that you're going to improve the most. Also, it is something to note that the LSAT is scored from 120 to 180 on a percentile scale. Median is usually around 150. Also, on the topic of scores, I do want to note that schools in Ontario, people do consider them relatively competitive in terms of, how they look at your LSAT scores, how they look at your GPAs, but I do want to preface this by saying that schools are more holistic than you think, than, these myths are out there. There is this threshold number that a lot of people use, and it's 160, where people say, if you get a 160, you are considered competitive for admission. But I do want to say that I know people who have gotten in with 150s, or even I've heard of people who have gotten in with 140s. So if LSAT is not your strongest portion, you do have other sections of your application to fall back on. I know people who have really, really high LSAT scores, but they may not have gotten into the school they wanted, and I know people with relatively lower LSAT scores who got into that same dream school. It does come down to who you are as a person, all sections of the application, not just LSAT, not just GPA, not just personal statements, not just reference letters, but all of those things put together. So in terms of actually practicing for the LSAT, how long does it take? What are some tips and tricks? I would say for me, applying to law school was a relatively last minute decision for me. I didn't really know for sure that I wanted to apply to law school within the year that I was in. So I wrote the November LSAT and I started studying in September, so it was kind of just 2 months, and I was taking a full course load in school, so I was kind of busy, but I made sure to at least practice for 2-3 hours a day, every single day. Obviously, in terms of practice, person to person, it varies so much, and for some people it might take months, for some people it might take years, for some people it might take a couple of months. I would say the very first thing you do is you write a diagnostic to see where you're at in terms of what your score is. You don't practice, you don't prepare for it, just blindly write one diagnostic test, see where you're at, and then based on there you adjust your practice schedule. Score really, really high, you might not need to practice as much. If you're not at the score that you want to be at, or that there's a lot of improvement, study for however long it takes to reach that score. I would say to also keep in mind when you actually want to write your LSAT. If you don't get the score you want, when are you going to rewrite it? So you're still competitive for admission, and you can still apply within the application cycle that you want to apply for. January is your last date to apply within that same admission cycle. There are, potential downsides to writing your LSAT all the way in January, because there are already people who have been admitted and already have their LSAT scores in. Law schools, they're not going to even look into your application until you have your LSAT, you have your LSAT writing portion. Students who already have their LSAT score when they apply on November 1st, and if they have the scores they need, they are going to be admitted before students who don't have their LSAT scores until, January, February. So that is something you want to consider. I mean, personally for me, I wrote it again, as I said, in November. So my scores weren't available even to me until the end of December. It takes time to even send them to the schools. So schools didn't even get my scores until January. And by that time, a lot of schools had their first round of admissions. It is a potential thing you might want to consider in terms of your competitiveness for admission. So I'm not going to share my personal LSAT score because I think that is personal, but I do really want to preface this by saying that you are more than just a score. Obviously, there is always room for improvement, and I do believe the more you practice, the better you're going to get at the LSAT, and the more you get familiar with the questions, the better you're going to get with the questions. It's not the end-all be-all of your application, and I don't think that's how law schools look at it either. The next most important thing, given LSAT scores, is your GPA. So your GPA is something that, again, it really varies based on who is accepted to law school. Again, there are a bunch of myths out there about you have this GPA, you'll get into this school, you have this GPA, you won't get into this school. I would say something to keep in mind is you should look into schools, and usually they won't say a cutoff, but they will say this is our average GPA of admitted applicants from last year. That does give you kind of a ballpark of where you want to be in terms of your GPA. So I know there is this website that I use. I'm not sure exactly how reliable it is, but I would say based on my own personal experience, it is relatively reliable. It's called lawapplicants.ca. I think that's the direct URL. You just plug in your GPA, your LSAT, and it'll kind of tell you where you stand in terms of your competitiveness for certain schools. Obviously, a potential thing you can look at to kind of see where you want to be in terms of your GPA and your LSAT. Now, again, something to keep in mind is that law schools do look at GPA in a bunch of different ways. For example, some schools will take your CGPA, so that's your cumulative GPAs. Other schools will look at your 3 best. I know U of T will look at your 3 best years. Queens, I think, looks at your 2 best. And I think even when they're looking at CGPA, schools do understand that a bunch of stuff comes up within these 4 years of university. So again, GPA is not the end-all be-all. I would say to look at individual school websites, see exactly how they consider GPA, whether they consider your best 3, your top 2, or your CGPA, and then also keep in mind their mean. It helps you make a more logical decision of exactly what schools you want to apply to and what schools are feasible for you to get in. Shoot for the stars, apply to the schools that you want to go to, because you never know. With these schools, you do also have to be mindful of the fact that if you haven't completed university, I personally applied in my 3rd year of university. I didn't have all of my grades in. They're obviously not going to consider my 3 best years because my 3 best years were my only years. That might be a potential downfall, and that's why some people do wait until they're done university to apply to law schools. So now in terms of programs, which obviously directly correlate with your GPA, law schools will always say, do whatever program you think you can do well in. And I know there is kind of this idea that most law students do come from a social sciences background. That is just not true, and people have come from a diverse range of programs, and I think that directly speaks to your experience of why you want to go to law school. You can talk about the kind of law that you might want to go into or what made you interested in law school. That's something you can speak to when it comes to your personal statement. I personally did a double major in human biology and political science, feasibly kind of see whether A, you like the program, B, whether you can do well in the program. And those are the 2 things I think you really need to keep in mind. You do want to come with a more diverse background, a more interdisciplinary view of law and the legal field, and I do think when you're talking about your programs, that's something you can directly speak to in your personal statements. Basically, on LSAS, which is the Ontario Law School Application website, basically they take 3 reference letters, and you can look into different law schools, and they do have different requirements for what they want to see out of reference letters, whether that is 1 non-academic and 1 academic, or 2 academic, 1 non-academic. I would say to go with 2 academic and 1 non-academic, just because there are a lot of schools who are looking for 2 academic, and you don't want to put in 2 non-academic and only 1 academic. Again, law schools are looking for people who can speak to your academic experience, your academic career, how you are as a student. See that 1 non-academic adds in your extracurriculars, your potential work experience. I know for me, I asked 2 of my professors who were in political science, and then I asked my supervisor for an internship I did in the summer. You are looking for professors who can speak to who you are as a student and how you've progressed as a student. The reality is some of us don't really have these really close relationships with professors, so in that case, I would say that professors do usually know how to write law school applications, especially if you're asking social sciences professors, just how, life sciences professors, they know how to write med school applications. That is something that I know most professors are willing to do. And you know what? It is a part of their job as your instructor to kind of help you get further on in your academic career. And I personally didn't do this, but I know a lot of applicants do try to have this coherent understanding of who they are as as a law school applicant. So they will write like potential rough drafts for people who are writing the reference letters. And I think that is something you should do if you have the time. Kind of indicate to your referees what you want to include in their reference letter and what you don't want them to include necessarily. In terms of reference letters, just like anything, it's not the end all be all. I did have a reference letter that I didn't think was the most effective reference letter. I would say it didn't affect my chances of getting into the schools that I wanted to get into. As long as you do have people that can speak to who you are as a person, who you are as an applicant, who you are as a potential future law student, then you're good to go. This is where you get to tell law schools who you are as a person, who you are as a law school applicant, and who you are as a potential law school student. You do kind of want to frame this in the sense of you know that you want to be a lawyer, and these are the reasons why you want to be a lawyer. Make sure you're just underscoring why you want to go to law school, why this is important to you, and why you can see yourself as a future lawyer. Also, I would say really try to be different and really speak to your experiences. Kind of try to set yourself apart from other applicants. I know a lot of people do have these similar experiences in terms of like, I volunteered at a law school office, I have a political science program. Try to set yourself apart, try to speak to experiences that other law school applicants might not have. You know, speaking to why you can make a difference in the legal field in and of itself. You need to act like you are already a lawyer, you already have that agency to make a difference. Like, this is not the place to be shy or timid about your experiences and your accomplishments. You can't expect law schools to read between the lines. You really need to underscore, you know, like, this is my GPA, this is my LSAT score, these are my experiences, this is why I deserve a place in your competitive pool of applicants and I should be accepted into your law school, and this is why I want to be a lawyer, this is why I'm going to make a difference in the legal field. Pretend you're writing a reference letter for yourself. Also, I would say try to form a cohesive argument within your personal statement. I kind of dealt with my personal statement as, you know, an essay. I had my thesis statement, I had my supporting arguments, I kind of referenced my supporting arguments back to the thesis statement. Also, a tip is you can see sample personal statements on different law schools. They do have them posted. I know U of T has a bunch posted. It does provide you like a kind of basic framework of what you should be saying, how you should be framing it. I think honestly the biggest thing is you need to be yourself, you need to be honest about who you are as a person and why you want to go to law school, and you are trying to be honest with law schools because I do think they can kind of catch on to this plasticity in your answers. If you're just saying things for the sake of saying them, you do kind of need to show that, you know, this is who I am as a person, and your personal statement really does speak to that. Also, another tip is make sure you tailor it to each law school. So having this one personal statement that you can use for all these different law schools, which make this basic case for why you want to go to law school, why they should accept you, but tailor it to each school, whether that's looking into if there's a specific clinic you're interested in their law school, or a specific program, or a specific course, a specific professor. Make sure these law schools know that you've done some research into their law school and you are taking this seriously, you are keeping it formal. You do want to keep this formal as much as it is a personal statement. It is a personal statement for an academic, prestigious graduate program, and making sure you're really editing for your grammatical errors in your sentence structure. That's obviously some things that you want people to look over for you. I would say a lot of professors are willing to look over personal statements and kind of give you your general ideas on them. Just speak to who you are as a person, and you know, a lot of us do kind of feel like we fall into this mediocre category as compared to these other astounding students who have had these amazing experiences. You know, you are your own person and you've had your own experiences, and that shapes you as who you are, and that shapes potential impact you're going to have in the legal career moving forward. So on the LSAT application, there's also a section for your autobiographical sketch, and this is essentially where you're going to outline all your activities since high school. So whatever you've done, whatever clubs you've been a part on, whatever work experience you have, whatever research projects you might have worked on. So this is a really brief section. You can put up to 32 entries, I think. I do think a lot of people don't really consider the autobiographical sketch as a really important portion, but again, as with everything, you should weigh all of these sections of your application equally. You never know what is going to be the defining factor for what helps you get into law school. What is important, and kind of this main idea of forming a cohesive application, is making sure that you're listing whatever you listed in your personal statement. Let's say you said, I volunteered for this organization for these many years. Make sure you put that in your autobiographical sketch. That's kind of there to verify that this is something that you did. And finally, I do really want to say that as much as we don't want to think that law schools are holistic, they do look at aspects other than your GPA, your LSAT. A lot of people can speak to that experience where law schools have looked beyond certain aspects of their application which they themselves deemed inadmissible. So again, don't make these judgments for yourself. Leave that up to the law schools. Also be hopeful, because that is a huge aspect of getting into law school. You never know what is going to be the factor that helps you get in. I think it's also important to remember this is a competitive process, and the reality is a lot of people just don't get in per cycle, but there is always next cycle, there's always next year, there's always stuff you can add to, your experience. So don't get too caught up in the numbers, don't get too caught up in the prestige prestige of the school. I do think there's a lot of improvements that need to be made in the legal field in terms of inclusivity and diversity. Never allow yourself to be overwhelmed by these numbers and this whole application process. Remember your worth as a person, remember your worth as an applicant, because I do believe if you have that drive, you can get in, you should get in, and you can make a difference in the legal field. So that's all I have to say for now. If you have any questions, you can let me know. I'm open to answering any questions because I kind of wish someone was there for me when I was going through this whole application process. That's all. Thank you for watching.